Okay, so tonight we welcome back Jeff Klapes. Jeff Klapes has been the head of reference services at Wakefield Beebe Library for 26 years, where he's also known as a traveling librarian. Having visited more than 50 countries and 5 continents over the years, he does frequent armchair travel presentations showcasing the history and culture of various places, using photography to capture people, scenery, and local details. From Iceland to Namibia, Laos to Oman, Jeff has visited many off the beaten places, as well as more popular ports of call. And of course, as a librarian, he also reads voraciously about his destinations to learn about their culture, history, politics, literature, nature, and cuisine. And tonight we will be going to southern England and Wales. Traditional market towns, rural British villages, and rugged coastal scenery are all packed into a small geographic area, making southern Britain an ideal area for the inquisitive traveler. There's fascinating industrial heritage, historic castles, and stately homes, as well as the stunning rolling green natural landscape. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to Jeff. Jeff, are you sharing your screen tonight?
Not yet, but I will.
Okay, great.
Let's see.
Let me know if you have any issues with that.
Did you let me share? Yeah, okay, looks like I can share. So welcome everyone. Thanks for coming back. If this is not your first time, if it is your first time, welcome. As Jess said, I do love to travel, and this, as you can imagine, the past year and a half or so has been kind of difficult for all of us who like to travel. This is a trip I did actually only about a year before COVID hit. So it was relatively recent. For those of you who have already done this, you know the drill. I like to do these programs very informally, so do feel free to pop questions in the chat as we go along, and I'll keep an eye on that. But I will also, once the program is over, I'll stay as long as you'd like. If you have any questions or comments, I always like to hear from anyone who may have traveled to where we're going tonight. I like to hear other people's experiences and stories and see how they compare to my own. So do feel free to share any comments or questions that you have. I also, you'll see my email, and I'm happy to answer any questions after the program. If you think of something tomorrow or next week, feel free to contact me and I'll do my best to answer things for you. So I'm going to share my screen now. If I can figure out which one to share. There we go. How does that look? Are you seeing the first slide?
Yes.
Good. Okay. So as I said, we're going to focus basically on southern Wales tonight. And I want to kind of put things on the map for you at the very beginning. Wales, which is the section that you can see here in yellow, is part of the United Kingdom. It has only about 3 million people. It's relatively small in area. It's if you imagine the state of Connecticut, and which is a rectangle, and turn it kind of 90 degrees, you'd about have roughly the size of Wales, with only about 3 million people in it. So it's fairly rural. Most of the people in Wales do speak English, but there are still about 500,000 Welsh speakers sprinkled throughout the country, and the country is officially bilingual. So when you travel there, you will see road signs, menus, street signs. If you go to a museum, you'll see all the explanations in both Welsh and in English. Of course, it does have a very strong national identity. There's a lot of very specific Welsh traditions, and there's a long history of conflict and friendly rivalry between England and Wales through the centuries, and you can still see quite a bit of that today. Just to give you an idea of where we're going, tonight, when we were there, we rented a car and spent probably at least a week and a half, I think, driving around Wales from top to bottom. Tonight's program is going to focus mostly on just the southern part of Wales. I have a separate program that covers the top, which in many ways is quite different. Maybe at some point later, we'll be able to do that program for you as well. And I'm going to start in the city of Newport, which is right at the bottom, but basically I should go back one moment here. We're going to start here after crossing from Bristol across the Severn Estuary, Bristol Channel over to Newport. We're going to head over through Cardiff and head all the way along through Pembrokeshire along the coast and end up halfway up the coast in Aberystwyth. That's roughly the itinerary we'll be looking at tonight. And to start in Newport, which is a pretty good sized city, it's the first thing that you get to right after you cross the Severn Estuary. And it's not one of the more touristy destinations in Wales, but it's worth it to stop there for a couple of interesting sites, particularly industrial related. Wales has a lot of very fascinating, if you like this sort of thing, museums and sites related to Britain's industrial heritage and engineering heritage. And there's a fascinating one right here in Newport, which is known for its unusual transporter bridge. This was built in 1906, and it's very different from what you would normally expect to see here. Why didn't they just build a bridge? Why didn't they just use ferries? And there were reasons for that. And it's because the riverbanks along this part of the Severn are actually quite low. And in order to create a bridge that ships could pass under to get up to Bristol, they would have to have very, very long approaches for the traffic that was going to approach the bridge and go over it. So that really didn't work. The other option was to use ferries, but ferries don't work here either because the river gets extremely shallow at low tide. So what they came up with instead is what they call a transporter bridge, which actually is like a derrick, if you will. You drive onto this thing here with your car or as a passenger or a bicyclist, and there is a derrick that actually carries this all the way across the river, connects it to the other side, and gets people back and forth across the river. Unfortunately, at the time that we were there, it is still in use, but at the time we were there, it was closed for some renovations and restorations. So we weren't able to actually cross it, but they were demonstrating how it worked. And again, if you like this kind of, if you have any engineering background or just like mechanical things, it's a fascinating thing to see because it's unlike almost any bridge that you've ever seen anywhere else. If you go a little further along towards the west, you come to Cardiff, which is the capital of Wales. For those of you who know anything about Wales or speak Welsh, I have included Welsh, the Welsh language names for a lot of the places that we're seeing. I will not embarrass myself by attempting to pronounce Welsh because it's a very, very difficult language to pronounce, and I'm certainly not good at it. So I will use the more common English terms. So Cardiff is the capital. It's roughly the size of Boston, a little bit smaller, but still a very big city, but also a big city that's very manageable. This is where we stayed right along one of the rivers in this bed and breakfast here. It's on the River Taff, which you can see going along up through here. There's some other rivers as well. And unusually, it has kind of two main centers of the city. There's the old historic town, which is way up here. And then a lot of the more Victorian era city has spread towards the coast. And much more recently, there's a lot of redeveloped waterfront all around Cardiff Bay, which is along here. And we're going to see both of those areas. I'm going to call attention also to the Cardiff Bay Barrage, which we'll see as well. This is a dam and lock system that protects the bay and allows shipping to go back and forth. So again, this is the lovely little B&B that we stayed in right along the river. It had some really nice views. And Cardiff has nice neighborhoods that are full of these beautiful old, very typical British style row houses that you can see in cities all over England. and the rest of the British Isles. The view from our bed and breakfast also looked across this bridge to a very large park, which we'll see in a minute, which is where the Cardiff Castle is located. We'll stop there in just a moment. And looking the other direction, you can look down the river and you see this enormous stadium over on the left, which is the massive rugby stadium for Cardiff. You may know that Wales is incredibly into rugby. It's the national sport. It's played in this very large stadium. It's easily as popular there as American style football or baseball is here in the United States. There's a closer up view of the stadium. There's a lot of lovely places to walk along the river here, where they've got pedestrianized waterfronts and promenades. But in contrast to the very modern stadium, you've got Cardiff Castle, which is probably the premier sight to see in the city if you're passing through as a visitor. It's an amalgam actually of several different buildings over a very long period of time. And the oldest of them is over here on the right. You can see the 11th century Motte Bailey Castle, which was built by the invading Normans. And then on the left, over here, there's a later castle, which was built 200-300 years later, that was completely remodeled in the 19th century in a very high Victorian Gothic style. And I'll show you some of the interiors there to give you an idea of what that style is like. So you can explore this whole complex. It's quite large, and visit all the different parts of the castle complex. The 19th century castle has a lot of what they call high Victorian Gothic. And that means a lot of very detailed decorations. Here's the view from the tower looking along. You can see the Victorian castle along on the right. The whole complex is surrounded by medieval walls, and there's foundations left from different time periods. And it looks towards the water through the newer part of the city. But the interior of the later castle is really fantastic and is full of kind of over-the-top romantic style decorations that have paintings and frescoes and elaborate furnishings and incredibly detailed ceilings and sculptures. Here's the library. And you can see what I mean when I refer to it as Victorian Gothic. This is not early Gothic from 1,000 years ago. This is 19th century Gothic revival, but it still makes use of all the standard styles of arched windows and the typical styles that you would see in Gothic architecture from the Middle Ages, but reused in a way that makes it much more homey. Might be too not quite the right word for a castle like this, but it is actually a very comfortable cluttered Victorian style. And you can tour this part of the castle as well as all the rest. Much of what you're seeing here was designed, both the inside and the outside, by an architect named Gilbert Scott, who is famous for doing a number of other similar style buildings around the British Isles. Probably one of his best known ones is St. Pancras train station, the hotel and train station in downtown London. He also built a number of private homes, but also he's also famous for designing the Albert Memorial, which is right across from Albert Hall in downtown London as well. And they all have a very similar style. This is probably the most famous room in the castle, called the Arab Room, with this fantastic Moorish style ceiling that's totally un-English in style, and has just incredible detail and gold decoration. And in fact, way up at the top, that theme continues with this almost Moroccan style, Arabian style courtyard that's way high up on the very top with an open roof. It's a great castle if you're traveling with children, because it has all kinds of fascinating rooms to explore and stairways. And if you like whether medieval or modern castles, kids would probably really enjoy this. The view from the top, when you get up to the top of the castle, is fantastic. You can see all over the city, both the historic area and also towards the new section of town towards the water. As part of the complex, you can also visit the tunnels all the way around this huge, it covers several city blocks in size. There's a number of tunnels which were used during World War II, and they run underneath all the protective walls. And during World War II, they were used as air raid shelters, and they had room for as many as 1,800 people at a time to stay there. So they have an excellent museum showing the history of the original castle and the tunnels, but also how they were repurposed in the war to be used in a completely different way. And just across the way, as you cross the river, right where the castle is, there's a fun little bridge, another thing that's kind of great for kids. It's called the Animal Wall, and it was designed by the same architect that did the castle. So all along are these fanciful sculptures of different, both real and mythical animals, which are kind of fun just as an outdoor sculpture park with the castle in the background. So downtown Cardiff overall has an enormous pedestrianized shopping district. It's a great place to just sort of stroll around, and you can see a great mix of Victorian. Here's another really nice sort of Gothic revival building. Lots of Victorian style commercial buildings that have been repurposed into condominiums and offices and restaurants and shops. It's a very, very vibrant street scene there. It's also well known for having a number of historic arcades. This is one of them from the 19th century. Those are indoor shopping centers, usually with glass ceilings. A lot of these were built during the Industrial Revolution to show off iron architecture and glass. And the city is full of them, and they're fun to explore. And they're still used today as modern shopping centers as well. But a lot of the architecture through the city has that kind of very British look to it, mostly from the 19th century. And here's a good example of one of those indoor arcades, which are Victorian in style, but completely protect you from the weather and are full of shops and restaurants. And like I said, there's an enormous part of this downtown area that is completely blocked off for pedestrians without any vehicle traffic. Here's the public library. And as a librarian, of course, I always have to visit public libraries anywhere I go. This one is a bit unusual because it's so modern in the midst of this very historic city. You can see what a completely different style of architecture this is. I was also interested because in addition to being a standard public library with all the typical services that you'd see in your own library in Chelmsford, a significant part of the building was also given over to social services. So in addition to going there to get books, it's a place where you would go to be connected to questions about healthcare and homelessness and job searching and all kinds of things. So in addition to librarians, they've filled the building with direct service, social service people as well in one very inviting space, which I thought was an interesting way to do things. And it seems to be very successful for them. Here's a good example of a typical sign in Wales where you see both the Welsh language and English as well. And some more examples of these really elaborate and very beautiful arcades. In addition to the arcades, they even have a traditional European style food hall, which is quite large, was built at the end of the 19th century and is still used as a food hall today. So you can go there and buy vegetables and fruits and meats and cheeses and as well as craft products and tourist things as well. Here's some more examples of all of these really nice arcades. There are some excellent museums in Cardiff, but I found one of the nicest things to do was just to stroll around. There's just beautiful streets. We were lucky to have some very nice weather while we were there. There's an excellent art scene. There's a huge university in Cardiff, so of course there's a lot of students there, and consequently a lot of cultural activities going on in the city too. Further inland, when you get away from the coast, up towards where the castle is the more central historic government center of the city, and that includes City Hall, which you can see here on the right, and the courthouses. You can also see the Welsh dragon in a number of places, which is a symbol of Wales. This really incredible City Hall. And they have a superb natural history museum, which for a city this size is very impressive. And of course, there's quite a few museums and arts complexes connected to the university. Cardiff University is quite well known. And this is one of the more recent buildings that is dedicated to the arts. And many of those departments at the university have all kinds of publicly accessible arts events that you can go to, dance and theater and concerts and so forth. In the middle of this part of the city also too is an enormous park, very green park with playing fields called Butte Park. It's a very typical English park. There's a lot of just large trees, open lawns. It's not a very formal park like you'd see in France, for example. It's just a place to stroll in the shade and find some nature right in the middle of the city. There's some incredible trees. This was kind of funny. I just liked the idea that there was a brand of brewery in Cardiff that is known as Brains, and you can get that in any pub that you visit. Brains is a very common brand of beer or ale, and they have a brewery still in the center of town. It's a very regional brand around Cardiff. Moving back towards the waterfront, where the city looks completely different and very modern. Much of this has been redeveloped over, say, the last 20, 25 years. And there's a lot of waterfront activities, there's boating, there's restaurants and shops. This is probably the signature building there around what is called Roald Dahl Plus. And you will presumably remember Roald Dahl. He wrote Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and any number of other very well-known children's stories. And he was born in Cardiff, hence the plaza in his name. So this very modern open space with a fountain in the middle and these light towers is used for public events and performances. And it has as its backdrop this enormous building, very unusual modern building, which I'll show you in one sec. I also had to stop here because I don't know if any of you are fans of Doctor Who, which is a beloved British science fiction show that goes back at least 50 years. About 10 years ago, Doctor Who had a spin-off called Torchwood, which was also quite popular if you like science fiction and British television. And it takes place here right in the center of Cardiff. And in fact, this huge metal tower that you see on the right, which is a waterfall. You can't really tell from this photo, but there is water streaming down the outside. This is the entrance to the, of course, entirely fictional headquarters of the mysterious Torchwood offices that are below the streets of Cardiff. And what you're seeing behind me, where I'm standing here, is a shrine to one of the characters. And it's kind of interesting because Yanto, who was this character, he dies in a later episode, one of the later seasons of the show, and was so beloved by fans of the program that they created this shrine. And it looks almost as though he was a real person. In fact, I would say there's probably more stuff on this shrine than there is to the one on Diana back in London or in Paris where she died. So I had to make a pilgrimage as a fan of the show. But this whole plaza has as its backdrop this fascinating building that's very different from anything you've probably seen elsewhere, called the Wales Millennium Center, which was opened in 2009. And it's an enormous performance venue, which is used for theater and dance and opera and music concerts and so forth. It's got this incredible sheath of copper that shines beautifully during the daytime and has Welsh writing on it. And at night, all of this is lit up from the inside, so the letters actually glow in the evening. It's quite beautiful. The letters are in both English and in Welsh, and what they say is, "In these stones, horizons sing." But it's an enormous building and has become a symbol of the city. If you keep walking along this promenade, you can see that building is kind of hidden behind. But if you keep going along the waterfront, the brick structure on the left is called the Pierhead, which was built in 1897. And it was the headquarters originally of one of the big shipping companies. Cardiff, then as now, was a major port for maritime trade. It has been converted now and restored into an exhibition meeting space. When we were there was a very interesting art exhibit on the upper floors. The modern building on the right that you see is called the Senedd, S-E-N-E-D-D, but that is the Welsh word referring to the National Assembly of Wales. It was designed by a pretty famous architect called Richard Rogers, who has built a number of things throughout Europe and the Americas as well. And if you can walk quite a distance, in fact, you can walk all the way around this harbor, and you get great views back to the city, where you can see the Millennium Center and the other buildings along the coast. If you work your way all the way around, you will eventually come to the locks and barrier that I'll show you in a sec. All along here too, there are you can rent bicycles, and there are restaurants and shops and cafes. There's also quite a few very expensive condominiums. So it's kind of interesting to see how Cardiff has very successfully blended its history, which goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, with extremely modern style of architecture, and also just a lifestyle too. It's a very young city. It's a very vibrant city. This is the barrage, which was built to control the river flow. Much of this area that we've been walking around is actually tidal mudflats, which makes it very difficult for shipping because the water level can often get quite low. This whole lock system was completed in 1999. It was pretty controversial when they built it for environmental reasons. And even today, it is not without its problems. But what it does is it maintains the bay that is protected behind the barriers is kept largely fresh water, as opposed to the brackish water that it would have originally been when it was open to the ocean. But it allows boat traffic to go through through a series of locks, and does flood control and keeps the bay at a more or less stable level. for such a large tidal plateau. You may wonder why I'm taking a picture of a large rock, but basically this is a big hunk of coal. It was part of an exhibit that you can see along the walkway, because of course Wales is well known for its coal mining, much less so today than in the past. But there's a lot of places where, again, if you're interested in the industrial history of Britain, there are some very fascinating places to go to see coal mining and slate quarries and a lot of the other industrial heritage that Britain has to show. So we're going to leave Cardiff and work our way inland just a little bit. This is an interesting photo that shows you the change in energy sources, because of course all along in the coalfield valleys of southern Wales, this was where coal mining was done and was such an important part of the image of Wales for many, many years. And yet now many of those coal mines are closed or closing. And you can see what is replacing them in the background are wind turbines that are used for energy production. And in fact, off the coast of North Wales, we won't see that tonight, is the third largest offshore wind farm in the entire world, is off the coast of the very northern part of Wales and produces an enormous amount of electricity. Most of the fields, the coal fields in Wales, are in the south. There are a few in the north, but the ones around Cardiff and Swansea, which is a little further to the west, are by far the largest, and in fact are among the largest in the world. You can still see the remnants of coal pits and slag heaps all around. Most of the mines at this point are closed, and within the last maybe 20 years was about when the last mine started to really close down. So it's been a big change, obviously, in the economy of the area as it's had to adapt, considering how many of these small towns existed almost exclusively because of the coal industry. This particular one that we're looking at here is called Gilfach Goch, and it's the town on which the fictional story of How Green Was My Valley was based. So if you have ever read the book or seen the film, the classic film, it's based on this particular village, which still exists today. And again, the landscape is very typical, dense little towns of row houses that were built for the families of the coal miners. And you can still see up in the background areas where the leftover parts of the slag heaps and entrances of the coal mines used to be. Also in this area is a very beautiful natural area where there was no coal mining, so it was very protected. The Brecon Beacons are a national park area that is among the most beautiful in all of Wales, and one of the most wild areas in southern Britain. We climbed the tallest of the peaks, which is called Pen y Fan. It's only 2,900 feet, which doesn't seem like that much, but it still makes for an enjoyable hike. And because it's the highest peak in the area, the views are quite spectacular, and it's extremely barren. So you can see for miles and miles in every direction. It's a relatively accessible hike. You don't have to be in incredibly good shape. It's not like mountain climbing, but it's kind of strenuous, but it's very popular. And certainly the most dramatic part of this park. You can see how popular it is here, particularly on a beautiful sunny day like when we were there. But it's large enough that it's not too hard to get away from the crowds once you work your way up the hill. And you can see just how barren it is and exposed as you work your way towards the top. There are some fantastic views of mountain lakes off in the distance, like this one. There's sheep everywhere. And here we are at the top. This cairn at the top, where it announces that you made it to the very summit, is actually a burial site from the Bronze Age. And they've piled additional rocks on top of it. But this is as high as you can go in southern Wales. And it's just magnificent scenery. And you can see additional hiking trails go off all through the park. Another very popular thing to do in this area, because it is so isolated, it makes for very good night viewing. This is one of the areas in Britain that's known for its dark sky philosophy, where if you're there, if you're fortunate enough to be there on a clear night, which doesn't always happen in England and Wales, you will see really incredible nighttime star viewing there, because there's no light pollution for tens of miles in every direction. You can see a few sheep and horses there. But even with all the crowds, once you get up to the top, it's actually not that hard to get away from people and go off and find a little peaceful corner. The geology of this area is kind of interesting. It's mostly sedimentary. So there's a lot of sandstone and mudstone, like you can see here, that breaks in very even and sharp little bits. So that's the kind of rocks that you saw at the top, where the cairn was at the top. And if you keep working your way further towards the west, this whole mountainous area in the south of Wales is known as the Brecon Beacons. And if you work your way towards the west, you'll go through a lot of more populated areas of the beacons. And there are lots of villages, there's castles. This is probably the most famous of the castles and one of Wales's most dramatically situated ones, way at the west end of the Brecon Beacons, where the land slopes off and starts to become much more gentle. And Carrick-Kennen was built originally in the 12th century, but it didn't last long. By 300 years later, it was pretty much in ruins, although what ruins remain are reasonably well preserved, at least insofar as you can see the structure of the foundations and get an idea of how the layout of the castle was arranged. And if nothing else, it's just a beautiful spot to stop. There's a nice village that you can walk up through and have a green tea before or after your hike up to the top. And then because it's perched so high up on the top of the last of the Brecon Beacon Hills, looking towards the west, you get a really beautiful view of the rolling countryside, very pastoral, exactly the kind of typical green landscape that you would expect to see in Wales. I loved these horses that just sort of gave up and relaxed in the sun. It's hard not to when the weather is perfect in Wales, which it isn't very often. But it's a very imposing castle, as you can see, and obviously prominently situated here for defensive purposes. It can see miles and miles in every single direction. Not far from that, a little bit north, is another site that's, it's certainly not as dramatic, although it has beautiful views, but it's historically important. This is an Iron Age fort, and there are quite a few of them around England and Wales. This is one of two pretty impressive ruins that you can still see that go back to about 1000 BC, when there were settlements on these outcrops. And you can see what's left of the piled up rocks and foundations that were used to create these settlements. There's not really too much to see here, and not very many people go there. But again, the views are fantastic. I do have to mention a little bit about the driving in Wales. Many people are concerned about renting cars when they travel to Britain because you have to drive on the wrong side of the road. And I do have to say that that is probably the least of the issues that you might have to deal with. When everybody else is driving on the wrong side of the road, you pretty much get used to it pretty quickly. What's hard to get used to is that a lot of British roads, and many of the ones that we found in Wales, are extremely narrow. Many of them are quite old. In fact, I was reading a biography of, now I'm forgetting which king. It was an English king who, I believe it was one of the early Edwards. But he went in and invaded Wales. And one of his major complaints was that all of the roads were far too narrow. And he complained about that bitterly. Here we are about 1,500 years later, and it's still pretty much the same situation. And that's to a large degree because in many cases, they're the same roads. They've been there for so long. And there are so many very old buildings built very close to them that it's kind of hard to widen and expand a lot of these small country roads. So you will find that even in a tiny vehicle, it can be a little hair-raising to be driving along the roads with shrubbery on either side and come around the corner and see a site like this, for example, or worse yet, a speeding Welshman coming in the opposite direction who knows the roads way better than you are. Having said that, you really do need a car to get around because although most of the major towns and cities are accessible by train or by bus, in order to see most of the beauty of the countryside, you really do need your own transportation, and it would be hard to do that without a car. For example, you would be unlikely to come across things like this, which are bluebells in bloom. Just beautiful country scenery like that. Another place we stayed in the Brecon Beacon area is this castle called Craigie-Nos, which is a 19th century, another sort of Victorian style castle, completely reproduction. This is not an ancient castle. This was built entirely in the 19th century to look old and haunted. It was built originally and owned by an famous opera singer. And now it's a sort of frumpy hotel, but very comfortable. And it was fun to stay in just because it's fun to stay in a castle. It's conveniently located for a lot of stuff that you might want to see in this area. It is actually supposed to be haunted, as many buildings in Britain are. We did not see anything in any of the corridors or in our room at night, but it still has a lot of fun atmosphere if you want to stay in something that's akin to a medieval castle. It's very elegantly decorated inside. There are a lot of nice, comfortable rooms, public rooms that you can sit in and have a brandy and chat with people. And it's surrounded by the Brecon Beacon's countryside. This was the view from our room, looking out over the hills in the evening. And then again in the morning, this is exactly the same view when we woke up in the morning. On the way to the town, from here, we actually headed down to the coastline. That's what we're going to do for the next stretch, to the Pembrokeshire coastline. And I'm just showing you this because this is a very typical confusing. You think the roads in New England and the Boston area are confusing. You will often encounter very strange looking things like this. We were heading to Tenby. Underneath it, you can see the Welsh name, which again, as I said, I will not attempt to pronounce. This is a historic walled port town on the southern coast, perched way up high on a cliff. And it goes all the way back to the 13th century. But it's had its ups and downs throughout its history, and is now just a very pleasant seaside resort, and very popular, particularly in the summer months. We had kind of a gray day when we were there, but it was still very beautiful. unlike some of the other places we've seen, this is a town that was redeveloped at a time when Georgian architecture was popular. So that's why you see all these very elegant Georgian townhouses, all built very similar to one another along the coast, and painted in wonderful pastel colors along the promenade. There's a very nice and friendly public library, and lots of nice little streets with very pleasant houses, lots of bed and breakfasts, tea shops, all the typical things that you would expect in a town like this. They make a point to, they're very proud of the painting, the colors that you can see throughout the town. The beach was rather empty when we were there, given the weather, but it still is a pleasant place to walk around under the cliffs. There are some nooks and crannies that you can explore. And at the top of the cliffs is just one after another of these beautiful homes, most of which are either bed and breakfasts or apartments and condos at this point. The beach is very sandy, and in the summer is obviously much more popular than it is at the time that we were there, where the weather just wasn't quite beach weather. There's also this rock with a fortress just off the end, and a lot of more promenades that go all the way around the corner to the harbor. The town actually, it's interesting because they took the wrong side in the English Civil War. So they were significantly damaged during that time period in British history. And then they got the double whammy of getting hit by a plague after that. So for quite a long time, it kind of languished as a backwater that really didn't, the population plummeted. There wasn't really much of anything going on. And until the 19th century, it stayed that way until the early 19th century, when people started going back there to redevelop it and build the beautiful Georgian houses and turn it into a more popular 19th century beachside resort. And it remains that today. If you come all the way around the corner, you end up in this lovely harbor. You can see it was low tide when we were there. But it's quite a spot for vacationing. And it's a nice size. If you don't want a town that's too big and overwhelming, it has all the services that you could possibly want, but it's still, you can walk from one end to the other in about 20 minutes. And it's perfectly located as a place to stay if you are planning to do any exploring along the southern coastline. This whole area that we're in is called Pembrokeshire, and the Pembrokeshire National Park is another one of the national parks in Wales, and it has spectacular coastal scenery and a lot of very nice walks. In fact, Britain, you can almost walk all the way around the British Isles if you had enough time and energy to do that. They have made a concerted effort to link up a lot of public hiking paths all the way around the coast so that you can enjoy the scenery. And there's a lot of things to see in this stretch. Here's one in particular that's very pretty. You can just see it peeking out here. Hidden at the base of the cliffs is St. Govan's Chapel. This is a very old chapel. It was originally built in the 6th century when there was a monk, St. Govan, who lived there. But most of the building that you see there now was reconstructed later in the 13th century, but it's still quite old, obviously. And it's hidden, which makes it kind of fun. You have to clamber down a steep pathway to find this hermitage that's in just such a typical rugged British coastline, wedged in between the rocks. And this is all there is. There's not much to it, but the views are great. And when you go inside, you can imagine what it might have been like to be St. Govan or any one of the other hermits that have lived here over the centuries. Supposedly, St. Govan is actually buried under the altar, but that has not been proved, and very little is actually known about him in his actual life, which again, we're talking roughly 1,500 years ago. So much of his history has been lost in time. But it's well worth the stop if you're driving along the coast. If for no other reason than to just see the incredible rugged coastline. With this chapel looking like, almost like it's growing it organically out of the rock itself. There's a lot of dramatic walks along this Pembrokeshire coast. You can see in the background, you can see some parking lots at the top where people have stopped. The nice thing about walking on this coastline is you can do only as much as you feel up to. You don't have to start at one end and work your way all the way down. There's any number of places where you can stop and just walk along what is, for the most part, a fairly flat cliff top walk. So if you're not really into mountain climbing, it's not that strenuous, except in a few specific spots. And the scenery is very dramatic, as is bird watching, if you like seabirds in particular. And we worked our way all the way along this southern coast. And if you get all the way to the southwestern tip, you come to a town called St. David's at the extreme end of Wales. And we stayed in this very nice sort of boutique hotel called Penryhoo Priory, which has been converted into a very elegant boutique hotel. It was built in the 1880s as a vicarage, but now has very comfortable rooms, both in the main house and in some outbuildings as well. And they serve really nice meals, and it's just a very elegant place to stay. We would not normally have stayed here, but we hadn't planned ahead and found that there weren't very many options the night that we were there. So we treated ourselves to a night here. It was very, very pleasant. You can walk from the Priory, which is on the outskirts of the town, back into St. David's. It's about a 10-15 minute walk. And there's a number of beautiful old homes that are connected with the Priory close as you head back towards the village. St. David's, which I should point out does not have an apostrophe. It is actually David's with an S, is a small town with only about 1,800 people, but it's very famous because partly because of its location, but also because it has probably what is the most impressive church in all of Wales. It is the final resting place of St. David, who is the patron saint of Wales. He lived, like St. Govan, he lived in the 6th century AD. And the town now is just a very pleasant little tidy, quaint village center with nicely restored buildings. There's a lot of good places to eat, great pubs, and also a number of nice bed and breakfasts to stay in. It's a very pleasant town to just stroll around. And usually relatively quiet also. But the main attraction here, of course, is the cathedral itself and the associated bishop's palace, which is in ruins. You can see that in the background here. The cathedral was built in the late 12th century, but within about 100 years of its construction, it was hit by an earthquake and significantly damaged. The tower collapsed, the roof collapsed. So over the centuries since then, a lot of renovation change has happened over the centuries. These are more buildings in the cathedral close, which covers quite a large area, actually. And here's the facade. The building is unusual, I think, for churches in Europe because it's very squat. You can see it's made of very dark stone, which is much darker than you would expect a limestone or granite cathedral to have. And unusually, it's built in this kind of depression, which makes it almost invisible from far away, unlike a lot of other European cathedrals, which were specifically designed to be visible as you were approaching a cathedral town from across the countryside. You really can't see this church until you get almost right up to it. The interior is very British in style, and was significantly restored in the 19th century by the famous Gothic revival architect Gilbert Scott. I mentioned him earlier. And you can probably see some similar stylistic evidence here of that Victorian Gothic look that he was so well known for. The ceiling that you can see is actually made of wood, except in a few places. This is on one of the side aisles, this fan vaulting. But most of the ceiling that you see at the top is made of wood, mainly because of structural reasons. Since the cathedral was had suffered so much damage, rather than build a vaulted roof like you would normally expect to see in a Gothic cathedral, they felt that the building really was not able to support a traditional stone vaulted ceiling. So they ended up just creating a flat wooden roof, which was a lot safer. Nonetheless, you can see, particularly in certain parts of the building, that it is significantly tilted in certain areas. There's some beautiful carvings in the choir. This one is kind of interesting. It's the Green Man. I don't know if you're familiar with that character. He's a typical symbol of sort of the rebirth of spring and new growth in agriculture in the spring. And you'll often find the Green Man with leaves coming out of his mouth and his hair, and in sculptures, often in churches and buildings around the British Isles in particular. Here's another interesting sculpture with a number of men in a boat and a distinctly seasick passenger. Here's another good view of just how off-kilter their parts of the building are. But the close around the cathedral is quite beautiful. There's lovely gardens. And this is a nice view from kind of up high as you enter the area. And you get a better idea of how the church is really situated in this like little dell nestled down below the village. You can see the ruined bishop's palace in the background, which you can also visit separately from the church. The ocean itself is not terribly far away, just beyond those trees over there. But it is a highlight for historical and architectural reasons, and certainly for the Welsh. It is an incredibly important place to visit because of its connection with David. This is a couple more scenes of what's left of the bishop's palace. The tower that you see up on the top of the hill there still has the cathedral bells, and they ring throughout the day. It's the only one of the original 4 gates. You can see the gate just behind it here, that originally protected the cathedral close on all 4 sides. There's some beautiful cemetery stones there as well, with these lichens growing on them. And once you're done traipsing around, I recommend any number of pubs. Here's very traditional Welsh dinner, Welsh rarebit, and some nice local cider that you can get. The place we ate also had very good fish and chips. As you drive around the area, this is another of the typical Welsh roads I was talking about. Um, just about wide enough for one car, and there are a few places where if you meet somebody coming in the other direction, kind of squeeze by. One of the problems of these roads is that there are very often stone walls hidden in the hedgerows along the side, and you may not see them, so you think you can kind of squeeze along in this cow parsley, which is common all along Welsh roads. But in fact, they may be hiding a completely solid stone wall that you have to be careful of. Up the coast, a little bit up from St. David's, is Strumble Head, where there's a very nice lighthouse out on the headland, and you can see very typical moored, the kind of plant life that you would normally expect to see on moors, scrubby trees and shrubbery and heather all over the place. There's some beautiful heather that was in bloom while we were there. We were pretty much the only people on this road, which is why I thought it was kind of funny that they were predicting long delays ahead, because there were no long delays at all. We were the only car for probably 20 miles in any direction. An interesting site to see also in this area is called Castell Hendlys. I can't really say that with a good Welsh accent. This is another place that I would highly recommend if you're traveling with children. It's kind of akin to Plymouth Plantation or Sturbridge Village, but instead of recreating something that's from only a couple of centuries ago, this is an actual archaeological site and a recreation of a 2,000-year-old Iron Age hill fort. So there are a number of roundhouses and a granary that have been reconstructed, and it is still used as an active archaeological site, with researchers there continuing to dig in certain parts of the complex. But it's very atmospheric, again, looking out over the beautiful Welsh countryside. They do have character actors there who are just like at Plymouth Plantation there. They will take you on tours and talk a little bit about what it would have been like to live in an Iron Age settlement like this. Here's a rendering of what the site probably would have looked like on top of its hill when it was at the height of its settlement. There would have been protective walls. It was built high up so that it was protected by both the hill and the river down below, where they could pasture livestock and fish and so forth. And then there were protective palisades made out of wood and stone, which would have protected the settlement that was a number of these conical houses. And you can see, again, several of them have been reconstructed with the same type of thatch that would have been used in the original buildings to see what life might have been like there. Here's some the contrast between older thatch and very recently redone thatch. When we were there, there was a class of probably elementary school age kids being taken around the same way here. We all get dragged to Plymouth Plantation, but it really is a fascinating place, and you have the run of the place. You can explore all over the area, and there are people demonstrating how they would have lived in the houses, how they would have cooked, how they would have decorated. Here are some paintings inside inside the roundhouses, where they are duplicating designs that were found through their archaeological studies. And it's just very unlike a lot of the other kinds of things that you might normally see when you're traveling around Britain. It makes a nice contrast to visiting stately homes and castles and things like that, because it's a part of British history that's so much older than what many of us really know anything about. Very close to it, also across this beautiful landscape is another early site, even older actually, called Pentre Ifan, which is one of Wales's best known ancient monuments. There are 6 of these very big standing stones, and the capstone that you can see kind of floating on the top is 16 tons. That's how big it is. And it dates from the Neolithic period. So we're talking, about roughly 3500 BC, which makes it well over 5,000 years old. And it's really kind of incredible. Here's human for scale. But you can see how this 16-ton boulder is just barely hovering on these 3 tiny little points that are holding it up. It's quite something to see. There are different theories about what it was originally used for. The most logical one, because it's similar to a number of other sites around Europe in this time period, in the Neolithic period, is that it would have originally been covered by by earth rather. So the stones provided sort of a framework skeleton over which an enormous mound would have been built, and you would have entered the mound through some sort of corridor, and the space under the capstone would have been open, providing a roof for some sort of chamber inside. There are other archaeologists who studied it who think that there was actually no mound at all, and it was designed to be seen exactly as it is now, which is just an incredibly impressive stone monument where a major, incredibly heavy capstone was elegantly placed on these standing stones. Nobody really knows, and I'm sure the archaeologists will debate it for quite some time, but it's worth the visit just to see how dramatic it is, and also what a dramatic location it is, because it's from this hilltop you can see the ocean, you can see all the way up and down the western Welsh coast. It's just a beautiful, beautiful spot. Also along in this area, not far from St. David's, along the Pembrokeshire coast again, is a section called Marlowe's, which is another area that has very nice coastal hikes that you can do. It's a peninsula that actually sticks out into south off the southern coast of Wales. It's actually the peninsula right next to the one that St. David's is on. And they're separated by a very large bay called St. Bride's Bay. There's a few offshore islands that you can see in the distance here. The biggest one that in this image is called Scomer Island, very close to the coast. And it's a major seabird nesting site. If the weather isn't bad and at certain times of year, there are excursions, boat excursions, that will take you out there if you're interested in bird watching. There's also a lot of very nice flowers, the sort of heathland coastal botany that you might be interested in if you like wildflowers. It's an area that is very popular with puffins and northern gannets that nest on the islands offshore, and it has probably half the world's population of a seabird called the Manx shearwater from the Isle of Man. They winter or they migrate back and forth and often stop and nest here on these islands. But even if you don't leave the mainland, it's just a stunning spot to hike along and get a sense of just how wild parts of Britain are. Considering how densely populated the British Isles are, it's amazing how many places you can go and feel like you are in the middle of nowhere with no population anywhere near you. And this is definitely one of them. For scale, there's another couple of humans up there. it's a very bleak landscape, but if you have an attentive eye, you will definitely find all kinds of things to investigate down low, growing towards the ground. And if you look up, you will see birds all over the place. Here's some typical Brits walking along with their dog that's bigger than anyone else in the family. The two smaller islands that you can see off there are called Grassholm and Gateholm. And they're pretty inaccessible unless you are willing to take one of those boat excursions. And we're going to finish up by going partway up the coast, heading towards North Wales, and just stop in a couple of very typical Welsh towns. Aberaeron is not very large at all. You can see it was low tide when we were there. The prefix aber in Welsh means at the mouth of some sort of river. So there are a lot of towns that have similar names like that. And Aberaeron means that it's at the mouth of the Arun River, and which you can see coming out here. And it's another town that has just beautiful row houses painted in bright colors, the church off in the distance. One of many seaside towns where there really isn't a whole lot to do. It's just a resort town where you can hang out at the beach, go to the pub, and stroll around the shops. I wanted to give you a brief selection of some of my favorite Welsh town names. There is actually, if you make an effort to understand how Welsh works, these seemingly unpronounceable names actually follow a very consistent system. So a W has a particular sound, a double L has a particular sound, a Y has a particular sound. And if you learn those, you can actually pronounce Welsh without too much difficulty. But it is always funny to run into names like this. Isbiti Istwyth is one of them. Penis Arwen, which gets a lot of sniggers from teenage boys, as you can imagine, as is Panty Wacko and Splot, and my personal favorite, which is Plump down here. I just found one of the most enjoyable parts of the trip was just trying to make any attempt to learn something about the Welsh language. You certainly don't need it to travel around Wales, but it's fun to learn a little bit about how it works and to occasionally hear it spoken. Although you won't hear terribly much of it, but it is there. The next big town up the coast, and it's where we will end tonight's program, is Aberystwyth. Again, it's another one of those towns where the Aber refers to the fact that it's at the end of the Istwyth River. This is probably the biggest town anywhere along the western coast. It's a big market town. It's a resort. It's even a college town, although it's barely 20,000 people. But there's quite a lot packed in a small space. And it has, it almost feels like a small Cardiff. There's a lot going on, particularly because of the college. And it's situated right on the water. There was an original castle here, a 13th century castle built along with a lot of other Welsh castles in that time period. But most of the castle has disappeared except for a couple of foundations and towers, and it's been turned into a park. So there's this beautiful headland where you can see all the way across the bay to the headland opposite. This giant Victorian pile that you can see along the promenade was originally built as a hotel. And it never was a success as a hotel. It was built in the 1860s, again, in that sort of high Victorian style. But the hotel failed, and the building was donated to the university, and which Aberystwyth University was also started sometime in the late 19th century. So the building is now part of the university campus. But it is quite a pile, that sort of haunted looking over the top Victorian Gothic look. There's also a really nice old-fashioned amusement pier. And it was a little gray on the day that we were there, but there was still, they were doing a road race, and there were people walking up and down the promenade. It was, I can imagine on a sunny summer day, it would be absolutely beautiful. And like many of the other towns we've seen, there are these Georgian row houses that are brightly colored, so that even on a gray day, the town has a sense of being a very joyous place to visit. Aberystwyth, interestingly, has a higher than normal percentage of Welsh speakers. In the whole country of Wales, there's only about maybe 19–20% of citizens who report that they are able to actually speak Welsh fluently. But in Aberystwyth, it's actually almost twice that. This is this area and a little bit to the north as you head up toward the island of Alderney off the coast, is where the greatest concentration of Welsh speakers is. But as I said, if you're traveling there, English is what you would normally hear. And except for road signs, you really wouldn't encounter Welsh much at all. But if you do, it's a lot of fun to hear, because it's such a very different language from anything you've heard before. So I want to thank you for joining me tonight. I will stop my share. Oops. There we go. And feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions, or if you have any comments. Anyone?
What months were you there?
That's a good question. I actually forget.
Was it spring?
No. I want to say it was September. Is that true? Yes, it was September.
Oh,
roughly.
maybe.
Yeah, and we had some interesting weather. There was, obviously you expect to have a certain amount of gray and cloudy and rainy when you're in the British Isles, but we also had a surprising amount of very beautiful sunny weather. And of course, the rain is what makes it so beautifully green. So you have to take the good with the bad. But I have always found that unless it's torrentially pouring rain, which it didn't while we were there, even when it's kind of gray and misty, it's so typical of the British Isles that the place looks good even in that weather. I think it just always looks nice. But particularly if you're doing outdoor activities, it helps to have at least a little bit of sun. And for walking along the coastal paths, having nice, pleasant weather is good.
Hi, Jeff. We had a question come into the chat. The question is, what is Welsh rarebit?
Oh, what is Welsh rarebit? Yes. It is often mistakenly thought of as Welsh rabbit, which it is not. It's basically just melted cheese and beer on toast. It's a very simple, filling but uninteresting and unexciting food, but it's delicious. They take good crusty bread, melt cheese over the top of it, and it's got, it doesn't have to, but it often has ale mixed in it. And the photo I showed you was actually more of a trendy gastropub version of Welsh rarebit. But it's just a very hearty, simple food that has only a couple of basic ingredients. But when you imagine what it would be like to live in Wales, particularly 100 years ago or before, where you didn't have a whole lot, it was simple, filling peasant food, and it's still delicious. Particularly if you have a good, either some sort of, I'm not much of a beer drinker myself, but I love cider. And there's a lot of good local ciders there. Or if you like different kinds of ales, it goes good with that. It's good pub food.
Mm.
Someone mentioned the Welsh are known for singing. Yes, they are. And I didn't hear any singing, but there are, it's probably not hard to find, particularly in the larger towns, concerts of traditional Welsh songs. Yeah, well, the big things that come to mind with Wales are leeks, which is the national emblem, dragons, which you will see also as the national emblem, rugby, which is the national religion, and coal mining. And when you get up towards the north, it's less coal mining and more slate mining. There are a number of places. In fact, there's actually some good museums where you can visit the old slate mines, because much of the building that you see there with all the slate roofs and stuff all over, it had to come from somewhere, and much of it came from Wales, as did much of the coal that drove the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Do you wear the leek upon St. David's Day? I don't know. That's a good question. I wasn't there for St. David's Day. I have never worn a leek. I'm a fan of eating them, but I have never worn one. So I would have to look that up and find out what they do.
It's odd. Does anyone else have any other questions for Jeff tonight? Oh, it's from Henry V.
Oh, from Henry V.
Probably.
I have read and seen Henry V, but it was a long time ago, so I've forgotten all the references.
Any other questions? Thought I saw someone else unmute themselves.
Is there Welsh nationalism like Scotland? That's a good question. Yes, but not much. There is, I mean, obviously for centuries, way back when Edward was, in fact, what's interesting about Wales is a number of the most popular castles that you would visit as a tourist in Wales. Carnarvon, what's the other one? There's several, both in the south and the north. The majority of those castles that you would visit as Welsh castles were actually built by, I believe it was Edward I, when he was trying to subjugate Wales to become part of England. So all of those castles were actually built for protection for the English to take over and subjugate the country. So it's kind of ironic that now Wales gets a significant amount of its tourism by having people go and visit these, what originally were English castles. So certainly there was, for a very long time, there has been this conflict between the Welsh and the English, some of which, as I said, is kind of just friendly rivalry, and some of which goes way beyond that. There has never been the level of Welsh nationalism that there has been against the English in Ireland, for example, and definitely not as much separatism as there is in Scotland. So there's a very, very minor movement for Welsh independence from England, as there is for Scottish independence, but it has nowhere near the level of support in the population. There is certainly still, though, a very strong sense of Welsh identity, and the language is a big part of that. There are far more people, for example, who speak Welsh in Wales than there are people who speak Cornish in Cornwall, as an example. And Welsh is, as I said, is an official language that is recognized, and you see it everywhere that you go. It's very much a presence in the country, and but still there just hasn't been much of the kind of separatism that you would see in other parts of Europe, like the Basques or Catalonia or Scotland or other places where there are strong separatist movements. It's nowhere near that degree in Wales. Oh, I see a question about where you want to go next. I will go anywhere you want me to go, as long as I've been there. But if you are interested, I do have a continuation of this program, which is the northern part of Wales, which is similar in some ways, but also quite different. So I would be happy to do that for you at a later point, or I can talk to Jess about other options. And
I think Northern Wales sounds great. We can do that. Why don't we determine, I guess the next first Wednesday of the month would be Wednesday, the 1st of September. So
I
we
think
can,
that will work.
okay.
I'll email you tomorrow and we can coordinate, but I think that should probably be doable.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so everyone can just keep an eye on the calendar, and I'll make it official as soon as I can. But if nobody has any further questions, thank you very much, Jeff, for another
Thank you for having me
wonderful-
again. I'm glad to see some familiar faces again and some new ones as well. I hope to see you the next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Good night,
you.
everyone. Take care.
Thank
Good
you.
night.